We're going to color in Photoshop underneath our vector line art. So to get vector line, all right, once you have your illustration vectorized, whether you did it with Illustrator, whether you did it by scanning it in and live tracing it, once you've cleaned it up to your heart's content, I think I've got most things here using the pencil tool, using the blob brush. Then you're ready to color it. And all you have to do is save it as an EPS. There's also another way to even out your work that I'll show you in Illustrator. There's just a lot to learn. But let's just select this one. And if I go to Object, Path, Simplify, it will give me the option to just lessen the number of anchor points within it. So that's the number it started with. And it will kind of average them all out. It's like a smooth over everything. If you do it too much, you'll have very few anchor points. If you do it kind of at about 70%, it can make it maybe better than it was, right? So it was like that. I think that looks fine. But there are other ways to kind of smooth your work. Okay. Once it's done, there's always going to be things that bug me, but it's fine. We're going to say File, Save As, to our computer, an EPS. And I'm going to call this my final black line art, or Karl, because this is going to get turned in, black line art, into assignment 5. I need to be able to find that EPS. So it's the one with my name. It's actually right there. I'm going to actually move it to the desktop. And you can open it up in preview and see that you now, oh, it's the wrong one. You now have a vector. Said it went to assignment 5. There it is. So I'm going to mark that as purple. So when you view it and you zoom in, you won't see any pixels at all. That is a vector. My computer's working hard trying to keep up with all this. All right. Now, know where that is, but you're not going to open that with Photoshop. Instead, you're going to take Photoshop and you're going to say File, New, and you're going to create a new file that is 11 inches wide, this is true for everybody, by 14 inches tall, so larger than usual, by 350 pixels per inch. Then we are going to drag and drop our vector line art onto it, no matter how we made it, that EPS. And we're going to make that large within that 11 by 14 by 350. And because it's a vector, it's going to scale up. We hit return, and it will be perfectly clean to whatever that raster resolution is. And it will come in as a smart object, which is exactly what we want. And then we can lock it. What happens if we right-click and we open our EPS with Photoshop? It will force us to rasterize it. And its mode will be CMYK color, because that's the default Illustrator mode for printing. And we don't want that, because when you do that, even if you made it big enough, that rasterizes it in a way that is not a smart object anymore. So it can't be resized. And so you take away all the advantages of it being a vector. So instead, like we did for your color logo and making it print ready, you set up the Photoshop grid first, and then you drag and drop the EPS file into it. Now, I am ready to show you how to set up for coloring. You start with a blank background. I'm going to call this blank white. which is my background. And I'm going to lock that layer. And then on top of it, you have your vector line art, which I'm going to call black line art. And that's at the top. These are like two slices of bread. White bread on the bottom, German Schwarzbrot, dark bread on the top. Pumpernickel. Okay? So we're making a sandwich here. Both of them are locked. We are not going to add anything to those layers, but they're needed. In between the two sandwich layers, we're going to add a new layer, and we're going to call that flat color. What is flat color? Flat color is the most basic first step of digital coloring. If we look at Charlie Brown, here we have an image of Charlie Brown. When Charlie Brown was in color in newspapers, it would be in the Sunday edition. This was how it was colored. Each contained thing, what's called the local color, the skin tone, the shirt, the shoes. There's only 3 colors there. Black is not a color, white is not a color, right? So everywhere that his skin is showing, it's the same local flat color for that skin. It's a certain formulation of inks. Everywhere his shirt and socks are showing, it's the same local formulation of that yellow. There's no lights or darks in the color. It's just all filled in with one flat tone. When you get to the 3D versions in kind of new media of Charlie Brown, you'll see that there's not just one flat color for his shirt, his shoes, and his skin. Instead, you have all these variations, this gradient. That's called duotone soft edge color.
Do shadows count as that?
So duotones are what give you shadows. So then there is, let's see if there's an anime Charlie Brown, like fan art. So this is a good anime Charlie Brown, but this uses flat color as well, right? Which a lot of basic animation does. But I was hoping for something more like this. Because this is called cell shading in animation. In digital coloring, this is called duotone hard edge. And that's where you take the flat local color and you split it into a highlight and a shadow. That's not in the line art, that's in the coloring. So if it's soft edged, it looks like this. If it's hard edged, it looks like this.
So the cell shading is in the color?
Yes, it's in the color layer, not the line art. So here's a good example. That's just pretty simple duotone, where the local flat color of Charlie Brown's face is split into a highlight and a shadow color. Now the white is there, but white is not a color. So on any duotone, you can always add white and black. You can make it look super shiny. But duotone means that it's one flat color that's being changed into multiple highlights and shadows. And that's why it's called duotone, not two-tone.
Not using a gradient.
So a gradient is still duotone, but it's a gradient of a lighter version of the color and a darker version of the color. When you do a gradient between 2 different colors as a fill, that's what we call full spectrum. This all sounds complicated. I need you all to know it. You get to choose what type of digital coloring to use. So this is important, and it's on your final exam, and it's really helpful to understanding digital media. So if you go to assignments where it says assignment 5, and you click on an exhaustive explanation of digital coloring, you'll get these slides. So there's hard edge, there's soft edged, there's full spectrum, and there's flat color. The first thing you need to know is that everything starts with flat color. So this is an artist that's really impressive out of Pasadena, went to my art school, does mostly just their own prints of fan art and sells them that way, and they're usually licensed. But what you'll see in the process here is that clean line art, and then flat color, and then duotone. And then the finished is duotone, because they want that kind of animated look. This is my process. I have this sheet printed up and at the front of the room for your reference. So what are the steps? We've talked about how to get clean vector line art. Once you have that, flat local color means that each area, like his feet, his wings, the different feathers in his helmet, the different sections of his helmet, they can each get filled with a local color. Just like Charlie Brown's skin or Charlie Brown's shoes or Charlie Brown's shirt, right? That's your first step. Then from there, if you want to do more, if you don't want it to look like an old Sunday comic, you can start to add highlights with just white shapes, like look at the beak here, look at the side of the tail. But that still is flat color because you're not adding any other colors within your flat color. You're just adding white highlights. And then you can choose whether you want to do it hard-edged or soft-edged. This I did soft-edged, so I did a soft-edged duotone by adding softer highlights within the color and gradating between them with a soft brush. These are soft-edged highlights added in. So I'm basically playing more and more with the soft-edged duotone. And then until the last step, which is when I actually do coloring on top of the line art. So I get the little sparkles on the helmet and on the claws. And I change the black line to actually a complementary kind of rust-colored brown line.
Say a cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
Are they doing that for every frame?
Well, it's mostly done digitally now. So it can be rendered and then modified after it's colored.
Okay, so they
But-
color it and then they can modify it.
But let's talk about the history of it a little bit. So before digital coloring, like say the 1970s and 1980s, all printed matter was limited to these inks. It wasn't until the mid-80s that you started to have thousands of ink colors versus the 256 or so that were available. And this all comes from mixing cyan, magenta, and yellow inks with black on white paper. So flat coloring is its own step, and we actually call it flatting in the industry. And if you want an entry-level, reliable, very well-needed, highly sought-after digital art career, you can be a flatter. And a flatter goes into artwork for advertising, for comic books, for print media. And they take someone's finished digital inks or renders like this, and then they create flats that go behind them. And the flats are usually really almost arbitrary fluorescent colors because it makes it really easy to select that color by the colorist that comes next. So flatting is the first step in digital coloring, and sometimes it's done by a totally different artist than does the actual coloring. A lot of comic books are colored by a studio, and that studio hires flatters, and then it hires the actual named colorist to do the finishing touches. So I'll use Wonder Woman throughout this as an example, mostly because Wonder Woman has primary colors and Wonder Woman has a golden lasso, right? So the problem with flat coloring is if you ink the lasso and you ink it solid, how can you make it a golden lasso? You can't. So we'll get into how you deal with that. But this would be Wonder Woman with flat color. Flat local color. Here are some other examples of flat color with Wonder Woman. And these are examples where they're really finished off. This is the finished result. Remember that black and white are not colors. So even though this looks like it has a lot of shading, and it does, that's all full bleed shading or inking that's done as part of the line art. And you could put a white shape on that shield, and that doesn't change it from being flat color, because the only color that's there is one color, and that's that warm gray in that local color.
But I imagine as she moves through a frame,
Mm-hmm.
she's going to, like, those are going to change.
Yeah, so to answer your question, for cell shading animation, each frame had to be individually painted.
But not anymore.
Still, they kind of do. It's just, we've seen when we've animated digitally, it's easy to make a perfect copy. And so then you just have to modify the copy for the next frame. So here's an animation, and all this one did was animate the hair, right? So let's say that there's 50 frames in this animation. Because it's digital, they didn't need to recolor each thing for each frame. But as something moved, like if the shield moved up and down, they would just duplicate it and move it up and down.
So because the hair is black, they then...
Because the hair is black, yeah, they just kept it as a fill, as a full bleed, and then they just used like puppet warp and did it. Now the key to doing flat color well, and this